Alex.
I'm getting an echo.
It sounds like you're in a
Yeah, it is
cave.
a slight echo. You do sound a little far away.
And
But
we're
was it
live.
like I am? But
It
it wasn't
is.
until John came on.
It is Wednesday, March 3rd, 2021, 5:01 p.m. It is the third day of Pugilism Week. We have a pugilistic crew here ready to duke it out in the interagency rivalry that you haven't seen since World War II, when the Army and Navy couldn't decide who got credit for what. We've got the FBI taking on the CIA. The reason we're going to have no tech problems today is that the Russians are so eager for this program to go forward and these grievances to be aired that they have actually facilitated. I got a call from the GRU this morning asking, is there anything we can do to help that make sure the show goes off without a hitch? So I had them, check everybody's internet connections, make sure they were okay. We're going to have a swimmingly clean show today. And, spasiba, tovarishi. All right. From in the blue corner, the FBI side, we have Special Agent Pete Strzok, who has been spoiling for this fight for so long that I had to say, no, come on, it'll be fine. You'll have fun. He is going to represent the affirmative proposition that the FBI is the cooler agency. In the red corner, we have John Sipher and Alex Finley, two former CIA officers, both on the operations side. I got a lot of pushback for having two against one, but I just want to say Pete Strzok gets to carry a gun, and they only get brandy snifters and tobacco pipes. So it's a fair fight. We have set up the pre-debate poll, which agency is cooler. So the CIA is a little bit ahead in the pre-debate poll with 33%, but a plurality says equally cool or doesn't know. So there's a lot of room here for growth on both sides. And I just want to start off with a list of things.
Hold on. Pen.
Yeah. Bum bum ba ba bum ba ba bum ba ba bum 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 ba ba bum ba ba bum ba ba bum bum ba bum ba bum ba bum 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 ba 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 bum bum. Yeah, thank you. I've forgotten about that. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to debate completely meaningless interagency bullshit. So I just wanted to start off with a list of things that I think make the FBI cooler than the CIA, and a list of things that I think make the CIA cooler than the FBI. Just a little provocation to get people started. So on the FBI side, let's start with they do get to carry guns, and in the Hoover building,
Sort of the Proud Boys, but go ahead.
Well,
yeah,
they don't get to legally. In the Hoover building, I just want to say, if you want to ask, is somebody part of the team, or are they just an analyst or something? You say, is he gun carrying? Right? And so that's kind of badass. Number two, this is an important one. In the FBI, they don't have to hide behind State Department officials. Whereas, CIA people always have to pretend to be State Department officials. It's degrading. So that's number two. Number three, better accents in the Hoover building and in the Washington field office than you get at Langley. You get, you walk in there and it's like walking into the set of a combined Boston Irish, New Jersey Italian movie. You think people are faking it and they're not. And number four, as Todd Keck points out in the chat, Mike Pompeo never ran the FBI. All right,
everybody vote. Everybody vote.
On the other side of the ledger, CIA, much better campus. We were talking in the chat or in Twitter about who has the better cafeteria. But that started me thinking, it's not just the FBI cafeteria it's really unfortunate. It's not just that CIA has a better cafeteria. It's got the leafy green campus with the nice view over the river. It's quite pretty. And, you know, it's across the street from a Tony private day school. It's, you know, you'd like to go to college at the CIA. Number two, this is a big one. They don't need warrants. You know, if they want to,
where we're going,
like,
we don't need warrants.
Yeah, but they can just steal stuff, and that's pretty cool. You know, Mike Hayden said when he was in the movie that Alex Gibney made, we steal secrets. Now, like, no FBI director gets to say we steal secrets. You just don't get to say that.
I did get in trouble when I said that. Brennan claimed that we didn't do that, but that'd be
but he's wrong.
Yes, he is.
And number three, let's face it, CIA officers get to operate under findings, and that is super cool. Because, like, FBI doesn't get to, you know, you don't get to say, well, there's a presidential finding that says I get to do this. So. All right.
Can I quick mention one more? Like, Peter, can you see Alex there? That's what we call a woman. We actually have women officers.
John,
in the CIA.
In the FBI, we don't really make a
good.
distinction between men and women.
They
We're
can
past
do excellent
to...
work. We
They don't
use them
see
all the
gender.
time. They're not just secretaries like they are at the FBI. So just that's another one.
Wow.
All
Wow.
right.
Damn! Holy shit!
Okay,
That was
so
a hell of a first shot.
I love the way this is going. All right.
I'm scared.
Pete,
You missed a very important
If
one.
we want to go
I
down,
missed an
if we want to
important
go
one,
down the
Alex?
dangerous path of diversity, I will
I know,
take
it's
the
like-
CIA campus both by gender and race and line it up next to the FBI campus by gender and race, and we can have this fight right here and now because
oh my god!
Yeah, you do have a lot of hired help.
I think there's a this is a dangerous path to go down, but the FBI
right.
would win.
Alex
so, anyway,
says
go
we
ahead.
left out an important one in the CIA camp.
Yeah, well, a comparison. So the CIA, we get to work in super cool exotic locales, although we can never tell you about it. And then with the FBI, you have like Des Moines
In Newark.
and Newark.
And yeah, and in the FBI, so 56 field offices, 400-ish resident agencies, and legal attaches, last I checked, in over 40 countries or so. So a breadth of reach that is both domestic as well as international, doing
Wait,
God's
hold on.
work.
I think I'm sensing a theme. I should ask a question and then you guys should answer. So, clothing. What clothing are you allowed to wear, Alex, to go to work?
What?
Can you wear anything you want, or do you have to wear a suit?
No, you can wear anything you want. In fact, I've been out for a while, but there was to the point where it's getting a little iffy where you had some of the young ones wearing like camisoles and flip-flops.
Yeah.
Whereas
Are you
Pete,
allowed to
you
wear
guys
camisoles and
only
flip-flops
get to wear
in
white
the
shirts,
FBI?
right?
Yeah, I mean, at headquarters for sure. I would, in general, just from a headquarters to headquarters perspective, agency dress is better. I think that just goes along with the kind of the
Look at the
right
shoes.
bank
Look at
stuffy
the shoes.
elitist Ivy League
Welcome, John.
Brooks
Good for
Brothers
you.
sort of Burberry
All right.
dress.
So Pete, since you're outnumbered, you get the first crack. Make the case that FBI rules and CIA rules.
It's funny. I was talking to John ahead of time, trying to figure out whether or not we really wanted to do this at all, and figured we could find a way to finesse it to talk about some third issue. But look, I think they're very. It's an interesting comparison because people naturally want to line us up because we do a lot of work together, both domestically as well as overseas, and have very similar missions when it comes to the national security space, but at the same time have very, very different masters and objectives. And so inevitably that leads to conflict. And, one of the things I was thinking is like, what are the most kind of tangible differences that I would say, well, the FBI is better. and it depends because this is very individual specific, but certainly the draw to the FBI to me is there is a very immediately tangible sense of what you're doing, whether or not, in a broad range of things that you do. So whether it's counterintelligence work or counterterrorism work or crimes against children or white collar crime, gangs, art theft, stockbrokers who are Medicaid, Medicare fraud, across the board, there's such a broad range of things you can do, and you get to see the tangible impact in the community. When you arrest a child predator, when you go out and you take out a gang that has been just harassing and bringing a community to its knees, you get to see the direct impact of what you're doing. And at the same time, there are these kind of much more sort of higher end, lesser, less immediate reward type work. Counterintelligence work is very much like intelligence work. There's not a kind of an end state. It's just this perpetual battle. So if you want to go to very intellectually challenging endeavors where you're working against nation states or terrorist organizations, you can do it. If you want to turn around and crack some heads of people who are terrorizing a community, you can go do that too. And that sort of sense of fulfillment is very satisfying. And I think it gives in some ways, I was thinking, is it fair to say that there's less moral ambiguity? I'm not certain about that. And I'm curious what both John and Alex think about that perspective. I think all of the work that both agencies do, that I saw with the agency, there are elements like that. So I don't know that that's a fair comparison. But, bottom line, I'd say the variety of work, the tangible satisfaction of the work, the fact that, if you want to, obviously you can do what you want in the U.S., but if you want to work overseas, you can do that. I mean, you can go work in a legal attaché. I did casework in 5 continents, easily 20 different countries all around the world. So there is international work within the FBI. So it kind of lets you go to all those different environments and kind of, find satisfaction there. And last thing. I think by its nature, the Bureau's work is, and you all may very much push back on this, it's much more collaborative. We're not measured by, I think officers are very much measured by the sense of, who have you recruited? How successful are they? What's their level of access? What sort of intel are they producing? And that can be a very competitive thing sometimes, not always. But I think the Bureau's stuff, there isn't that same, people work cases, but there's not a competitive sense of, I've got a better case than you do, or, the boss can only give out 2 promotions based on who had the bigger case. So I think the environment tends to be more team oriented, and feel free to tell me I'm full of it, because I may be wrong about that, but I always got the sense that the competition I saw amongst officers was a little greater than the competition I saw between agents, FBI agents, not source agents. But feel free to push back on that if I'm wrong about it. But anyway, so that's my opening salvo.
All right, Alex, you next. Pete decidedly did not attack your agency here, so you have a chance to land some blows and finish off the foe. What sucks about the FBI?
In the spirit of joint agency cooperation, I would actually agree with a lot of what he said, and you could apply to CIA as well. Because I would say we also have a lot of coordination. We work as teams. There's definitely a mission. And I had something else clever, and now I just lost it. So John's going to save me on that one.
Well, let me start with the nice part first. Is it, the friction between the 2 agencies is very true. It's been since the beginning, from the Hoover Donovan days, but it's also natural, right? Culture, the cultures clash. Culture develops around mission, and our missions are different. And in fact, to simplify it, the FBI are cops and we're robbers. Our job is to go overseas and steal things. Their job is to follow laws, regulations, and catch people committing crime. So there's a natural.
Isn't it funny that you all work for the government? That's just
yeah. And so if I want to, and so I've done a lot of work with the FBI. I've been involved in mole hunts. I've worked in the domestic field. I ran our domestic program. When we work together, it's incredibly good. It can be very personal sometimes with the FBI, officer to officer, as opposed to sort of institutional. If I have a complaint, it's exactly the one that Peter brings up, is the variety of things. And my issue is with the FBI is they have too much to do. how do you train someone that's going to do, oh, now I'm going to go after a child predator. Oh, well, now I'm going to go after a government official. And then, oh, but now I'm doing counterintelligence. Oh, yeah, I'm an intelligence officer as well. Oh, counterterrorism. Yeah, I do that as well. You cannot, an organization needs to have a distinct focus. The CIA's focus is only on recruiting people, training them. All of our things are put together for collecting and disseminating and analyzing intelligence. And the Bureau guys that I've worked with on counterintelligence have been very, very good for the most part. We've done great work together. But I worry now when I see Director Wray sitting up giving testimony today about the FBI as a domestic intelligence agency. What did they have on right-wing groups, all this kind of stuff. After 9/11, we were told that, and I have some stories about this we'll get into later, but the FBI is nope, we're going to do the domestic intelligence thing. We're going to do foreign intelligence and we're going to do domestic intelligence. And what I heard today was, well, we can't open a case unless we have an open case on that. Oh, no, there needs to be a predicate for that. Oh, no, we made some phone calls. We did some emails. That is not an intelligence agency. Intelligence agency should have been disseminating information all along, providing analytic products on these right-wing groups and other kinds of things, having experts come out and speak to police groups, all these other kind of things. My concern is not with the FBI's law enforcement. I think that they're the best in the world, and I'm proud of them. It's that they also want to be all of these other things, a domestic intelligence agency and a foreign intelligence agency and a counterterrorism agency.
So my response to that, I think it is appropriate that they do that, and I'll lay out the reasons why. The first is I agree with you. There is a split within the Bureau. I mean, historically, as you pointed out, a lot of people said, oh, the Bureau started doing intel after 9/11. Well, that's not true. The Bureau was doing intel back in 30 years before the CIA was born, coming out, or the OSS was born. So
the Bureau put out 0 intel reports on terrorism in the decade prior to 9/11.
Right. We put out a significant number of IRs. If you look at the number of Russians that we recruited in the U.S. and handed it off to the agency to run overseas, whether Russia, China, or other targets, that was substantive, and it went back throughout the Cold War.
It's counterintelligence work.
But I think you're absolutely right that within the Bureau, if you look, there is a split between, kind of historically, the CIA guys were more cerebral. They didn't talk to anybody. They kind of kept to themselves. Everything was classified and compartmented. And then you had, kind of the criminal guys who, and people not look down on each other, but you had very different worlds. 9/11, you had a ton of people thrust, and particularly the CT mission, who had no experience in intel, who hadn't been CI. So you saw a lot of organizational conflict, I think, of people who were showing up that were working gangs or bank robbery or white collar, whatever the case may be, and suddenly you're trying to figure out what Al-Qaeda is. But I think turning to intelligence, there's a really, really critical and important point to make here. And that is when you talk about domestic intelligence, you're talking about domestic foreign intelligence. There's a radical difference in the distinction between saying the FBI is going to sit in the United States and collect information about what foreign powers are doing in the United States, what their plans and collection priorities and who they're targeting and how they're targeting it on behalf of a foreign power. That is a radically different activity than it is to look at individuals within the United States who are engaging in activity that is core to the American experience, that is protected by the First Amendment, that is in many cases political expression that is going up to, and past in some cases, lawful expression. But it isn't fair to say I think, go after the FBI today and say, well, where was all your intel? Well, the FBI isn't going on to Facebook, can't go on to Facebook or Twitter and just read what is largely protected First Amendment activity. And in that way, I mean, I started in the Bureau in '96 as a domestic terrorism analyst. And I got in trouble literally the second week because we had LexisNexis. There was no, Google to speak of. And it printed out a article coming out of the Northwest about a meeting of a white supremacist group, and said, hey, this is great. We need to start putting all this in a file. And the attorneys came back and said, you can't do that. You don't have a predicated case. Yes, this is hate speech, but it's not illegal hate speech. We can't put this together in a system of records. And that didn't spring out of, from Athena, out of Zeus's head, from one of Ben's favorite expressions. I mean, that was the result of this awfully painful, horrible experience of the 50s and 60s and 70s in Church and Pike and the CIA keeping mail covers of, John, 300,000 Americans. 300,000 Americans that the CIA was targeting and collecting their mail. And, the FBI was doing horrific, horrible stuff that when there was all this oversight and need for reform, this kind of balancing of the social contract between the American populace and the government said, we don't want anybody in the government collecting this sort of information. And so now all those procedures, I mean, they were alive and well in 96. And as far as I can tell, they're substantively similar today. The regulations of the kind of legal underpinnings under those regulations haven't changed. And we had this horrible failure, I believe it was a failure, on January 6th. And so the question is, is the information there to have been able to have stopped it? And I think the answer is yes. The harder question is, okay, do you want the government collecting it? And not do you want the government, President Biden and Attorney General Garland supervising the collection of this activity? Do you want the government, President Trump and Attorney General Barr supervising this collection activity?
All right.
So
I want to focus on that.
Wait a minute. Wait, can I just say one?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
your point's a good one about the FBI, but I also remember after 9/11, there was the beginning of the debate whether we should have a domestic intelligence agency. Every single ally of ours, and most countries in the world do. And the FBI fought like rabid dogs to say, absolutely not. We're going to do it. That's our job. We should do it. And so they pushed back on the creation of a domestic intelligence agency that could do the very thing you're saying the FBI shouldn't do. And I agree with you, they shouldn't do it. You should not have arrest powers and the power to investigate American citizens. But I do believe we do need, I think January 6th shows us we need some version of somebody looking at these things that are professionals and have regulations and laws around them. And the FBI actively fought against creating such a thing. So
yeah, but I think,
and I would also argue that the culture is different in the FBI. Even after 2004, the idea of collecting intelligence and working as intelligence officers was sort of anathema to the law enforcement side. So the FBI officers that I worked with were law enforcement officers first. And so trying to switch them over to the side where we're not going to arrest them, we're not going to build a case, we want to watch them and see what they do and see what it leads to, was a very difficult culture to sort of break.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because I was completely shocked by the Wray hearing yesterday. And for some of the reasons that John describes, but for some other reasons too. I was less shocked by Wray's testimony than I was by the questions that he got. So I'm imagine that Bob Mueller had been in office for 3.5 years on 9/11 rather than what he actually was, which was in office for a week, I believe. So Mueller got a pass on 9/11 because he had literally been sworn in like the day before it happened or something. But imagine he'd been in office as Wray has 3.5 years, and he went up 2 months after 9/11, so we're now in December. For the first time, he goes to testify. And his presentation is basically, we did issue some warnings about Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalist terrorism over the last few years, and we've had a lot of open investigations, and by the way, more than under me than under Louis Freeh. And by the way, we gave some warnings that there was a possibility of violence, and that on 9/10, the Norfolk field office developed information that, some guys were going to crash planes into the World Trade Center. And so that information never made it to me. I didn't know about it until afterwards, but it was shared with the JTTF and communicated orally and by email to, New York authorities and the Port Authority of New York. He would have been flayed alive had he done that, right? I mean, people would have said, wait a minute, you had all these open investigations and you had no visibility into this thing that's going to happen. You didn't pick up the phone and call people and warn them when you got this thing. And how did you have so little visibility into it with all these open investigations that you're boasting of having? And this seems to me exactly what Wray did yesterday. And nobody called him on it. Nobody said to him, excuse me, Mr. Director, if 40,000 Muslims had shown up in Washington using the hashtag Storm the Capitol, Stop the Steal, do you think for a minute that you would have made some arrests? Nobody asked him the implicit bias question. Nobody asked him you're boasting of having all these open investigations. Why did none of them produce actionable leads? Why? And so my question is, whose side does that support in this conversation? Is it, first of all, am I wrong that Wray is being given a real pass? Secondly, to Pete, if I'm right and Wray is being given a real pass, doesn't it show that we don't actually expect the FBI to function like an intelligence agency? And to John and Alex, if I'm right and Wray is being given a real pass here, what would be the thing that an intelligence agency that's supposed to function like what you guys mean by an intelligence agency would have done that the FBI hasn't been doing over the previous, say, year? So, Pete, first defend your agency or attack the director of your agency, and then
Thanks,
John and Alex, home in for the kill. Then I'm going to go after the CIA.
Oh, man.
So I think I want to go down this hypothetical a little more. Had the events of 1/6 been done by a group of Al-Qaeda core or ISIS or any foreign group and had anywhere near the same level of success, you would have seen a much more adversarial hearing with Director Wray. I think what you're seeing, and I agree that there should have been more. I think the number of conspiracies that you've seen charged by DOJ indicates that there are people in groups who are planning ahead of time, that there's information there to be had. And they were planning illegal activity. So that's plenty of predication for a case. I think you look at, it turns out the Proud Boys who, when Roger Stone tweeted or posted online somewhere a picture of the judge in his trial with a crosshairs alongside her picture, they actually issued subpoenas and brought Proud Boys in to kind of get information about that. So, and that was in 2019. You can't tell me there isn't sufficient predication there. I mean, they had, and somebody had an open case to be issuing grand jury subpoenas. That there isn't, why did that not lead to more information about the Proud Boys, who are now in two different groups and charged with conspiracy activity? So the opportunities were there, but I don't think what you are seeing is a failure of intelligence. I think what you're seeing is a failure largely of one, the impact of 4 years of the Trump administration of absolutely stifling any investigation, any aggressive look into either him or people that support him. And two, I think that there is certainly three things. Two is certainly a sense of implicit bias. I do think, and this is a hard question to ask, and let alone get
about that?
I do. I think it is not, anytime you have an organization that is made up of largely white conservative males, there is always, I think, a question about whether or not you are going to take it easy.
There's that male thing again we just mentioned.
Yeah, all jokes aside, I want to hammer this point. No Democrat asked this question at this hearing Wray had yesterday. It is outrageous. Sorry, you were saying, sir.
Yeah, no, and the third is the whole issue of it is, if you get down to the core, the hard conversation we're going to have after were you doing the right things, and are you looking at the right people now? Do you have the right cases? And I was disappointed. I heard a bunch of proportions, twice as many as this, 4 times more this, half as much this double, but I never heard a number. I heard 2,000 cases, but I never heard a breakout of how much of that is, can we break it down right wing versus left wing? Can we break it down Antifa versus Proud Boys versus, radical violent white supremacists? Give me some idea of what represents the kind of meat of that, the totality of the 2,000. But if you strip all that away, you get to this question of what is the balance between in the domestic sense, the balance between security and protection versus our freedom of speech and the intrusion of government into that protected activity. And there's no domestic intelligence agency, there's no US MI5, there's no US CSIS, there's no U.S. organization that is formed new that is going to be exempt from the First Amendment. So any organization that you create, that you're wanting to give this mantle of a domestic intelligence agency, is immediately going to run into the same issues that the FBI ran into from 1911 all the way up through 1970 and 1980. But the FBI at least went through this really hard series of lessons learned and codified the procedures where at least we have a cultural ethos and rules and regulations where we're not DHS, Office of Intel Analysis, running around looking at Ben Wittes's web blogs and making those into IIRs. So I really
bravo
don't
on that.
But that's the hard.
Those really informed the internal government discussion.
That's the question at the end of the day. And what and good luck finding a responsible group of congressmen to have this debate. The FBI can shift. I think within their existing regulations, they can lean forward more than they're leaning forward in terms of collecting this information. But at the end of the day, you need some sort of the public imprimatur to say, 1/6 was horrible. We want the government to be a little more intrusive into looking at what we're saying in our political speech. And good luck, where 35% of the population are already convinced that that's underway. And it's just a hop, skip, and a jump back to the 1996, 1998, the UN black helicopters and the Zionist occupied government are coming in to take over all our political thought and speech.
So, Alex, if you were running... Let's bracket the domestic intelligence agency question, because I think Pete is right that the legal questions that constrain the FBI wouldn't be different if you called it MI5. So let's leave aside the bureaucratic question for now. But what does a stream of FBI work product over the year leading up to January 6th look like if a group of intelligence officers rather than cops run the FBI or run whatever intelligence service is doing this work?
Aside from spelling, you're talking about?
That's a given.
Wow.
and the powdered donut stains and all the all that, right?
I apologize. It's too easy.
No, it's look. There's low-hanging fruit with each of the agencies, man.
I made a list. It's much lower hanging with the FBI.
Oh, I don't know. Look, the FBI hasn't run secret prisons and waterboarded anybody over the last 15 years.
Fair.
Just saying. Anyway, Alex, the floor is yours.
Nobody said that the church and key commissions didn't exist for a reason. Maybe we still need to visit some of those. If you had a domestic intelligence agency over the last year, they would have recruited sources from these groups, pulled together corroborated intelligence about the plans and intentions, and distributed that information to the policymakers that would have maybe made a difference. I think one of the bigger things which Pete touched on is the political context here is completely different. So the FBI was under incredible pressure not to be collecting and finding out what was actually going on with these groups, because a lot of them were connected to Trump and his people. So in a way, it's a difficult analogy to draw.
John?
Let me add a little bit. So an intelligence agency, so the fundamental difference here, and this isn't just on the FBI because they are constrained by the things that we mentioned here, is if you're looking at the greater New York City area and you're trying to figure out what is the threat level there of terrorism, of domestic terrorism, white nationalism, whatever it is, an intelligence agency would look at the whole place, try to collect what they could, interview, use various, whatever techniques they could to figure out what's going in that area. What we heard from Director Wray was, oh, no, we can only investigate when we have an open case, a predicated case on whatever. So if there happens to be a case in Bronxville or in Massapequa or Newark, we can look a lot around that group of people, but maybe in a Manhattan, sorry, we got no open cases. So whatever's happening in Manhattan's off the books. An intelligence agency, by the way it's set up, has to be able to look at the entire picture, good, bad, everything, collect what they can by every means possible and figure out what is the situation there, good, bad, and ugly, and provide it to policymakers. Now, the FBI would, in any, like you said, any domestic intelligence agency would be constrained doing that, but we've never had that debate because the FBI fought it off, making the crazy complaint that if you create a domestic intelligence agency, it's like creating a Gestapo, when in fact it's the FBI that is both an intelligence agency and has the ability to arrest people. Now, it wouldn't be necessarily a domestic agency that doesn't have the ability. So let me tell you a quick story. So when I was at the agency after 9/11, I did one of these executive courses up at Harvard. And as you remember, Ernest May, famous Harvard historian, was the guy who actually wrote the 9/11 report. He was the writer. That's why the 9/11 report was so well written and so, easy to understand compared to the Mueller report, which was deadly and awful and hard to read. And during one of the classes, I raised my hand. I asked him a question. I said, listen, I didn't read the recommendations first, which is what everybody does with these things. And so in the 9/11 report, there was a bunch of recommendations. Everybody ran with those. I said, I read your text. And if you read the text, the biggest issue related to 9/11 and how we were prepared had to do with the FBI and domestic intelligence and domestic terror issues. And he laughed and he said, you're absolutely right. In fact, the biggest issue facing the commissioners was the FBI. What do we do? Do we get rid of it? Do we make a separate thing? But the question was so hard and there was such a difference of opinion between the commissioners that we decided just to put it all aside and not even deal with it in our recommendations. So all the recommendations had to do with the DNI and the CIA and congressional, all these other kind of things. And they didn't deal with the bigger issue of domestic intelligence. And it was really a missed opportunity. I mean, subsequently, a bunch of the commissioners came out and said all sorts of things about, their view of the FBI's performance in the lead up to 9/11 and what that meant. And you're right, because Mueller had only been there a week or so, I think they got a pass. And rather than put this on the FBI, we should put it on ourselves. There was never a real debate about, as a country, how do we want to be able to deal with these things? How should we look at them? And we missed that opportunity. And so now when Ray goes up there, he's still stuck with the same old, well, we have 2,000 cases, which is a meaningless thing to whether you have a knowledge of what the threat is against this country.
But I think to respond to that, I think we're still conflating two issues that must be kept separate. One is the idea of the FBI's intelligence capabilities in terms of a counterterrorism or foreign intelligence threat. And I think those are night and day better than they were after 9/11. I think clearly huge strides have been made about understanding what intelligence is, what sources can be tasked against it, fulfilling requirements and putting that out there. But that is night and day better than it was after 9/11, inarguably. I think the issue, though, that what we're seeing now, and why I hate to bring in yesterday, again, this is a radically different proposition than anything that relates to what Al Qaeda is doing, or what the SVR is doing, or what even a foreign narco-terrorist group is doing. This is something at the end of the day. This isn't who sets. When you're an officer, you go out. What are you collecting against? You have a collection requirement, right? Who sets that at the end of the day? The president and the NSC says, these are our collection requirements. They get the community to come in and they adjust them all the time and they vote and say what's, but at the end of the day, the whole purpose, when you come in as a case officer, what you're doing day in, day out, you're sitting there and saying, what are the primary requirements? Who do I either have or who do I go recruit to fulfill that? Who does that in this domestic sense? You want the president to say, I'm going to come up with these domestic political actors that I think are problematic, and I'm going to create those priorities. President Trump, who are your priorities? Bill Barr already told us. Antifa, radical leftist, people who are going around vandalizing things. Yeah, who, if you create this domestic, who comes up with this?
This is a totally deep point. And I actually made this point quite reluctantly on Lawfare because I didn't want to give the Trump people any ideas. But if the president wants to shift the intelligence collection priorities of the CIA, he can do that really easily. And isn't one of the cool things about the FBI that because it has these predication requirements, it's kind of resistant to, like it can investigate things that may be crimes, but it doesn't, the president doesn't just get to loose the FBI on his political opponents the way he can change the intelligence collection priorities. Trump wasn't smart enough to try, but aren't you guys a lot more vulnerable to that than the FBI is?
Well, I mean, I hate to say this, but, I respect Peter amazingly for what he's done, and to try to go after somebody who's been attacked by the president of the United States, it's impossible. He's weathered better storms than Alex and I can do. I lost my train of thought. Keep going. Sorry. So have
I
start
don't know.
drinking.
So let me-
Start drinking
I'll
early.
do that.
Against the CIA.
I agree with you when you say
Train of
in some ways that the CIA is more vulnerable to a Trump-like, although I would think of it more like a Cruz or a Hawley who actually knows and understands how those priority frameworks work. But I would also say within the CIA, particularly when you're dealing with operations, very few people in Washington actually understand how it works when you go out in the field and you have to collect this type of information. So even if those requirements kind of got shifted and changed, I think the people on the ground would still kind of stick with the requirements that they knew and understood were needed. That may be against what any legal person would tell me to say.
But that's just saying
But-
they would defy
wait.
the rules.
But I remember my point. My point is, okay, if we look back at the Trump administration, which should be so unusual that this won't happen again. Let's pray and hope. But who was the one that had their political finger in the air with these institutions? Which were there CIA officers that were fired during the Trump administration that you're aware of? They fired Peter and they fired McCabe for political reasons. Yes, they probably continued to do some investigations, but they also caved on really important things. They didn't protect their people on some pretty important things. And
So-
we didn't see that in the CIA.
Yeah, so I agree that the CIA, generally speaking, did a better job than the FBI at protecting its people. I
And
also
more than
think,
that, and its sources and its operations, and I
mean,
I agree with that.
the Bureau screwed a lot of people.
But isn't that just because the FBI is like essentially more visible? Like
Well,
in so
I-
many
I
ways.
think
and
it's
people
partly
are
because
more, like,
I think that's partly because the FBI actually spoke more truth to power than the CIA did in the Trump period in terms of like the Mueller investigation was not done through the CIA.
I don't think it was a truth to power or anything the agency well, I mean, I wasn't there in the Oval, obviously, seeing what the agency was or wasn't doing, but I think it was the Bureau posed in Mueller a much more immediate, tangible threat to Trump and his family.
Political threat. That's right.
You know, if Gina came in and said, "Hey, I've just beefed up Russia House 500%, and we're going to find the P tape," the heads would have rolled. But you know, she was smart enough to keep that
I'll give you that.
quiet
But
in the sub-basement.
Pompeo did go after the analysts who wrote the original report saying Russia had done all of this.
That's true.
So
But they weren't
KK,
fired.
you
But they
have
weren't fired.
important movie-based questions.
oh yes.
I want to hear all the legal before do the movie stuff, but then I want to hear your legal perspective. I want to hear a constitutional analysis of all the things
I don't want to like spoil law school for you, Pete, but we don't spend much of it talking about the FBI.
I am
to be
so far in
honest.
debt. I will never go to. You talk about curtilage, apparently.
Oh yeah, curtilage is like a whole thing. You're thinking that you're the people that we're talking about when we talk about Fourth Amendment. No, that's usually state and local police, and sometimes you guys. But like actually, like,
Peter, are you a lawyer? Were you a lawyer?
Oh no.
Okay.
Pete is that rare thing, neither a lawyer nor a forensic accountant, FBI agent.
Southwest Indiana State.
but still has the same fashion sense.
Pete is actually an artillery officer.
Wait,
That's right, Army. Sorry.
Yeah, he's got a army background. Oh. All right, Kate, what are the movie questions?
Okay, so in the pro column for the FBI, well, this could go either way. We can let the audience vote. The Departed. Is that
I think
a pro
you mean
or con FBI?
The Departed.
The Departed. I think this is pretty solidly in the anti-FBI category. Die Hard. I think that's like a pretty.
Yeah, the FBI does not do well in Die Hard.
Screw the pooch
Hey,
in Die Hard.
Take The Departed and go. So let me get my little point in. I have a Hollywood sort of production company, and we actually work with the writer of The Departed. William Monahan is doing a movie for us. In fact, we've been talking to Peter about helping us on some ideas and shows. But if I'm correct, Peter worked in the Boston field office of the FBI, which, if you look at the Whitey Bulger story, which is essentially what's behind The Departed and a number of other of those famous Boston movies, the FBI does not look good in that that situation. They essentially were working with organized crime. They were providing information to criminals.
I see your Whitey Bulger. I raise you one curveball and Ahmed Chalabi. Okay, we can.
Curveball was a German thing.
You want to talk Allende? Let's go. I am ready. I'm ready to go down
I don't
this
have
path.
that movie down.
Mossadegh, let's roll.
Oh, listen, I lived in countries in former Yugoslavia, and what's interesting about much of the rest of the world is countries make their case for how much power or how they should be vis-a-vis their neighbors based on some specific period in history where they had the best hand, and so they remember that very well, and they forget all the other stuff. And the FBI CIA thing can easily be played this way because we can go back through history, and I can find things the FBI did much better than the CIA did. I can find stuff the CIA did much better than the FBI did. So we got to be a little careful with playing that game. But
okay, so
the Departed thing, you specifically were in Boston, so I was just wondering if you had any insight into that.
I was in Boston. It was funny getting there. It took me 5 years to just realize how much of an outsider I was and how deep and complicated the history of that office and that episode ran. John Durham was installed across the street looking at it. We'd go to this little bagel place called Super Salad. I mean, the old FBI office was a beautiful spot, right downtown, like a stone's throw away from the granary.
Is that where they hid the
where Benjamin Franklin's buried? But we'd go, we'd sit there and but John Durham was there, and the amount of just pure animosity between what he was doing, between the state police, between the old people in the FBI was like nothing I'd seen. And it's just one of those, it took years just to appreciate how profoundly complicated that whole episode was.
Interesting.
All right.
I was just Pete. I wasn't trying to minimize the actual hard work that went into it in any way.
Serious movie question for you both. What is the best CIA movie and what is the best FBI movie? Just before Kate goes on to more movies. Best depiction of the FBI in a movie, best depiction of the CIA in a movie.
Oh, see, this is a hard question. I have been researching while everyone's been
go.
talking.
I don't want to usurp your research, Kate.
Yeah,
keep going.
I'm going to think while you keep going. We're going to demand an answer at the end.
So, in the pro FBI category, X-Files. I mean, what?
Twin Peaks.
Right. Okay, yes. I mean, okay, so and interestingly, the FBI, so for all of the outreach you guys do in other countries, John and Alex, the FBI also has been involved in Men in Black and other type, and so there's I just want to that these are some, and then I guess this would be an anti-FBI depending on how you feel about your anti-heroes, but The Sopranos and The Fugitive.
No, that's the Marshal Service.
Oh, you're
interesting. Yeah, good point.
Fucking right.
No
it
FBI
is the Marshal Service.
in Fugitive.
He's completely right. It is the Marshal Service.
Yeah.
The oldest law enforcement agency in the United States, which spent most of its early history catching fugitive slaves, and doesn't tell you that part when they say they're the oldest law enforcement agency in the United States.
Why are they not represented here? Okay, so anyways, you're correct. Fair enough. Good point, Ben Windes. 1 point for Ben. Silence of the Lambs in the pro FBI category, and lady FBI agent. Okay, John Sipher. So there you go. Don't please, Jody.
Also,
amazing.
In the TV shows, the recent show about psychological work in the Bureau on early psychological work on serial. Mindhunter is a great show, great depiction of the Bureau.
It is really good. Also, True Detective is local police. Never mind. Okay. Anti maybe FBI. Apparently John Travolta in Face Off is an FBI agent. I'm really sorry, Pete.
I'll absorb that one.
And also apparently Saw 4, 5, and 6 all have victims that are the FBI agents that are hunting the Saw killer. So we'll let that go. Okay, hold on. And now I have the CIA ones. Obviously Hunt for Red October. And then against in the anti-CIA camp, that was Alec Baldwin expertly playing the most perfect version of Jack Ryan that's ever existed, as you all know. And then we had then there was the forgettable moment of Ben Affleck and The Sum of All Fears. Let's never watch that or talk about it again. It should be remade and fast.
But Jack Ryan was an analyst, though. They're kind of the whippy guys.
Oh, we don't.
But they always make an analyst.
There is that whole.
Gary Matheson is an analyst.
There is that whole genre of CIA movies of the analyst gone rogue, which I believe began with 3 Days of the Condor.
Yeah, that. I mean,
good point.
Right? Like,
good point.
Where he says, "I'm just an analyst."
But before I just leave it, our analysts make CIA what it is. So I apologize. I'm just joking about.
Well, that's the whole.
Yeah, that's a pro forma statement.
You can't pick and choose here. Homeland. Thank you so much, Alex. I agree. I have mixed feelings about Homeland and its depiction generally of like Muslim.
Well, the problem with Ryan and Homeland is a lot of them are in the U.S. and it's like the CIA guys are like murdering people in the U.S. Like if the FBI thought we were doing that stuff,
we'd
all be in prison.
That was my closing argument.
Arrested me years ago.
When Alex joined up after 9/11, she'd been a journalist, and it was because she wanted to murder Americans.
And people in the United States.
I can understand that.
This whole reporting thing just doesn't involve enough physical violence against my fellow citizens. So I think I'll join the CIA and rampage around Omaha.
Kate, you got any others? Or
the Bourne movies? Those were he was like, but taking away an entire person's autonomy, brainwashing them, and giving them tons of drugs, and then forcing them into basically flee for their lives in fear of getting caught by the CIA. Maybe not like a
just a Tuesday,
movie.
regular Tuesday.
Not the best.
So, Alex, what is your favorite CIA movie?
I actually think Ronin is really good at showing how an operation works. Yeah. It's a little bit outside the box.
John, your favorite CIA movie?
Well, one of the reasons I got into doing this Hollywood stuff, which I'm doing, is because there aren't very many good ones, and there's so many amazing stories that can be twisted. But Hopscotch surely is the best CIA movie.
What did you think of the one about Iran based on the Iranian hostage situation based on, I'm forgetting the name of it.
Argo.
Yeah.
Argo's interesting because we have an internal sort of journal at the CIA, which is mostly classified, called Studies in Intelligence, but it has some unclassified articles.
Right. I mean, it declassified all that stuff.
Yeah. You can go and read them on. You search CIA, look in the library, you can read all the Studies in Intelligence. And that was a Studies in Intelligence article, interestingly enough, and took a while for sort of people to get it made, but it got made. It sort of takes some license. The bit about them being chased on the airplane as they were leaving was all sort of made up and stuff. But the basic story is true. That's actually a good movie. I think probably better than Hopscotch is funny though.
Pete, what's your favorite FBI movie? Just as a depiction of the way the Bureau works.
Probably The Town. It's not at all a CI movie. It's Ben Affleck, chasing a group of bank robbers up in Boston. So it's Boston. I know
all of these movies. Sorry.
But I know people who were in the FBI agreed to let them serve as technical assistants. So a lot of when you look at their kit or the way they're doing tactical stuff, it's accurate. And then if you want a Hoover throwback, I Was a Communist for the FBI, always a great film noir 1950-ish feeling movie, but it's not as a production value sit there and keep you on the edge of your seat. It's not going to do it, but it's a fun throwback. But again, to John's point, I just think there is and every time I watch some Le Carre movie or, I'm going through the Bureau right now, it's like there are good foreign produced series of movies about intelligence or counterintelligence work, but there hasn't been much done on the American side to our detriment. So, see what comes.
I think the American audience is now used to having this Homeland, Jack Ryan, everybody's a superhero. And the reality is there's a lot of other stuff that goes with it, and it's
But
much
they
more
miss out
nuanced
on,
and much more complicated. So we're trying to
Have you guys
get
seen The Lives
some
of
more real
Others?
stuff out there.
Yep.
Lives of Others is great.
Is a great movie.
I think that
Yes, it's a
that
great
gets
movie.
to Alex's point directly. Like The Lives of Others is such a profound movie about like the hardship of being both like having kind of an obligation to a greater entity and to a government, and then like also having a heart and a soul and like the work that goes into it.
All right, we're going to run a little long today because I want to get to some audience questions. Pat Gunn, the floor is yours.
Howdy. I'm curious about whether there's much career mobility between the FBI and CIA and vice versa. Are there many prominent people who have made that kind of transition? And if there are, is it known what their comments on how workplace cultures differ between the two?
Great question.
You want to go first, Peter?
Who do we know
go ahead.
who's been at both?
Alex. Well, first of all, there was this sort of narrative that came up after 9/11 that the FBI and the CIA didn't share anything, and there was nothing going on there. And in some ways, I mean, there's a few things, but that's not really true. There's been FBI officers inside CIA in almost every key area. In Russia, I was the deputy of Russia House when we were doing the Hansen investigation, other things. We had 2 FBI officers that were there with us in every single meeting with people in counterterrorism center, we had people in counterintelligence center. We've been working with FBI people for a long time. There's not to say that there weren't frictions and problems between them. And we've also then, more after sort of 9/11 time, we put some seniors over at FBI that sat in, the directors' meetings regularly, sort of a deputy to the National Security Branch chief, helping out over there and stuff. So there's been people sort of working back and forth. There's a few people that go back and forth. Historically, there's the famous, what's his name, Bill Harvey, the guy that did the Berlin Tunnel in the 1950s. I remember when I was in Moscow, we had a couple people came over from the FBI, came over to CIA because they wanted to do that kind of work. But not a lot. I mean, both organizations provide, a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. People like working for them, so it's not as if they want to leave and go work for the other ones. CIA gets a lot of people from the Defense Department that hate their job and come over to work for CIA, but we don't get a ton of FBI people. We have a lot of FBI people working with us, but. Yeah,
I think that's generally true. Certainly, as John said, with the FBI as well. We were bringing in, where it made sense, bringing in officers. It's always the CIA. Well, I don't want to get into size. There is a lot of exchange in terms of people who actually leave the organization and go to the other. Like John said, I don't know of many. There's always an issue on the bureau side. Certainly if you're going to go into a courtroom and testify about something, if you get some defense attorney who's saying, well, tell me about your professional background, and if you can't talk about your CIA work because it's classified, that creates a lot of potential problems. So that there are some legal impediments. I mean, that doesn't mean you can. I mean, there are things you can do to avoid court time or courtroom time. But I think John's right, and that's interesting. I think it says a lot for both organizations. People tend to go there and like it and stay. And we get a lot of folks from other agencies, but not so much the agency. But I think that speaks well of both organizations.
Alice, the floor is yours with a disruptive question, bringing in yet another agency.
Yeah, so I figured this would be maybe a way to realize you weren't so different after all. How does the NSA figure into this whole rivalry?
So the one, and Ben knew this joke, and I'm sure both Alex and John do too. The way you can tell a NSA extrovert is in the elevator. They're the ones that are staring at your shoes instead of theirs. The NSA has a very it is a very complementary mission. It is critical to a lot of the things the Bureau does on the counterintelligence side. We work with them on the counterintelligence front and the terrorism front in a lot of ways, but they are not. There's a similarity between the FBI and CIA, and that at the core of our business, it's going out and recruiting people, and human sources are sort of the money of the kingdom. And so there's a shared understanding and set of ways to think about things. And the NSA is very technical in nature, and very smarter, obviously. So you get the kind of associative personalities that come with that. And at least that's my bureau perspective. But again, there isn't. I don't see that sort of competitive antagonism. I don't think exists in the same way.
Because they don't have it with the bureau. They have it. I mean, to the extent that NSA has a cultural antagonism. It's with CIA, not with you guys.
Is it?
If we had an NSA person here,
I want to hear. I got two officers smiling at me. I don't know.
Yeah, because they know what I'm talking about.
So that's still there. But
if we had, let me channel an NSA wag for you. They would say, CIA produces scandal after scandal after scandal. We produce intelligence without scandal. This was before Snowden, when they started producing a little bit of scandal too.
Oh, okay.
But
minor detail.
But what they would say is we account for an inordinate percentage of the president's daily brief, of the raw intelligence in the president's daily brief. We are the workhorse of the federal intelligence community, and we don't get any attention because we just do things that are bread and butter intelligence production, like spying on networks, and we don't do covert ops at least in the sense that people think of them. With respect to CIA, we don't overthrow governments. We don't run prison systems. All the things that are we don't do. We're not what Rizzo used to call the pointy end of the spear with respect to presidential policy. We just produce intelligence, and so we get ignored, and we like it that way, except that we don't get any glory. And that would be the NSA account of it. But I think they have a pretty cooperative relationship with the Bureau. To the extent they have antagonism, it's with people like your opponents in this debate. Is that fair, John?
Well, I can remember when I worked domestically with the Bureau and stuff, I worked also with the Department of Energy and the national labs, for example. And I can remember talking to a Los Alamos senior executive one time, and they started in on this game of, you guys, it's terrible that you suborn people and you're out there doing these things and, stealing stuff. I don't know why we work with the CIA. What you do is sort of, and I was like, so you're cool though with like creating nuclear weapons that can destroy every human on Earth. That's okay. But if I happen to talk to one Russian who agrees to work with me against his own country, that's a bad thing. So in a certain sense, we're sort of the same thing. There's a little bit with the NSA where what they do, because it seems so clean and they're on computers, they think they're not committing espionage. They think they're not stealing things. But I've lived in these countries, and I'll tell you, when we steal stuff from them via the NSA, they see it as the same way as whether I'm stealing it by meeting a guy in an alley somewhere. It's all part of the U.S. intelligence community. Peter, the NSA, us, we're all doing the same thing to provide our policymakers with the best intelligence we can. And so the NSA is indeed true. They provide a bulk of the intelligence. They provide incredible stuff. We work with them closely, but there is sometimes that view that, this isn't really part of this grubby stealing like you guys engage in, when in fact this is just as grubby as anything else.
All right, Christopher Argyris, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Alex, and everyone, Pete and John.
You passed the test.
Yes. Okay, so John, you mentioned in passing earlier that you were the chief of the National Resources Division of the CIA, which is hardly ever talked about. So in light of that, I'm
in trouble.
And of course, I
was actually the deputy of that. I wasn't the chief. But go ahead.
Okay, sorry, deputy chief.
He killed the chief.
Yeah,
but was in an attempt to dethrone him, but was that was considered bad form, and so he never really ascended.
Well, we always know that the deputies actually run things in
exactly
right.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. So there we go.
The chief is now in Area 51.
Yeah. Okay. So and then of course, so it's often said that the FBI is like primarily the domestic law enforcement, and CIA does not collect or spy on Americans, but are focused overseas on foreigners. So could you guys both sides, Pete and John or Alex, please demystify, we talk about turf battles. Could you actually demystify what your agency does on the other's turf? So, John, could you explain natural resources? And Pete, could you explain the overseas Ligat?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll just go first because you mentioned Wherein first. So, there's actually a domestic collection part of the foreign intelligence before there was even a CIA. After the bombing in World War II of Japan and Germany, the bombing survey essentially came out and said, hey, listen, the amount of effort that the US government had to go to learn about ports and factories in Japan and Germany that we had to bomb. As we look at it now, we realize that 60 to 80% of information already existed in the United States. There were companies that had been dealing with Japanese port systems and shipping and all these companies around the world. And so essentially the US government wasted an incredible amount of time and energy rather than look inside about what kind of information intelligence that could support our foreign policy and our war fighting and our intelligence services for years and years. So there's always been this domestic part of foreign collection. And so NR division is essentially the part of CIA that works domestically. And so we have offices around the country, oftentimes embedded where they're working with the FBI, and it does two different things. It works with the FBI on the kind of people say, I'm just making this up. Say there's an Iranian nuclear scientist at Cal Berkeley who the FBI has been looking at and we're looking at, and we could actually develop a relationship with that person now while they're in the United States and then send them back into Iran to be a source for us. That's something that we should be doing. So that's something that NR works with the FBI on. But also this NR, National Resources Division of the CIA, also does things working with companies and academics and national labs, like I mentioned earlier, about the work and information that they have overseas. And so if there's a company that has people and things overseas that can help us, we talk to them. But unlike the Bureau that can investigate or go at any level of a company, the CIA is a foreign collection organization. We don't collect against Americans. We have to go openly to the CEO of a company and tell them exactly what we're doing, who we are, and what we're interested in. And if they're willing to cooperate with us, we can then work with them to sort of help collect the information we want to. If they don't want to, just make up a big company that you can think of and say, no, we can't touch anybody in that company. We can't talk to anybody else in that place. Now, the FBI still could because they're law enforcement. They have other capabilities. And so CIA has been doing that for a long time. And that's often where we work hand in glove with the FBI. And it's also where we have fights with the FBI because there's also a view that, oh my God, we're the FBI. We own the domestic space. You guys shouldn't be here. And I can remember, there was a big study of looking at all 56 FBI field offices and the cooperation between the CIA and the FBI. And it was really interesting. This is after 9/11. And one of the senior executives at the FBI, their headquarters, came to me because I was working at NR and said, listen, you have to be very careful here. You cannot cede this all to the FBI because the FBI, many officers there think like when you watch a TV show or movie, if there's a murder case, all the different law enforcement, police people come together and fight each other over who's in charge. He goes, the FBI is going to fight you guys over who's in charge of doing this mission. And they're going to fight tooth and nail. And if you give up, they'll win, but then they won't know what to do and they won't do it. They just want to win the fight. And so you guys have to stay in this fight and you have to continue to do that. And I think to that extent, it's silly. I'm oversimplifying, but we in the FBI need to be better at working together, doing that piece of the puzzle. And so that's sort of what the CIA does domestically.
Can I ask a question that has always, speaking of like my very basic knowledge of all of this stuff, but has always like kind of been a huge question to me? Like, why exactly is there so much fight jurisdictionally between agencies and various types of police? Like, why would you want a murder, for example, or jurisdiction? I mean, yes, like why would you want to take that on? Like, why not let the marshal service have jurisdiction over the fucking guy that's fleeing and willing to run through sewers?
Peter
right?
can answer that
Like,
question
why
because
would you
the
fight for
FBI, like
that?
we're talking about CIA, FBI fights. I mean, there are FBI fights with local police too. Like there's these weird dynamics, between these different organizations, and some of it is just petty, and some of it is because the missions are different and the culture develops around the mission. So I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah, can I just say on there's a joking side to this question where the answer is
a really serious question.
because I want to do it rather than let somebody else do it. But there's also a mission side of the question, right? When the CIA looks at a scene, when you kick down a door as a CIA officer and you get into an apartment, you see a whole array of puzzle pieces that can inform your judgment about all kinds of things. When you kick down that same door and enter that same apartment as an FBI agent, you're interested in the chain of custody of each of those items. You're interested in how you would testify about how you acquired them, about whether you were allowed to kick down that door. It's a whole different set of questions. And if the CIA officer gets in there in front of you and starts going through that material and exploiting it for operational value, he's fucked up your case. And similarly, if you have to wait to process any of that information as the CIA guy while the FBI person puts it in bags and marks every bag and preserves, like, he's fucked up your opportunity to do something with it. So there's a real legitimate, part of it is just a methodological, what are you seeing when you look at that room?
I see some of that, but I think that there has to be something more intuitive or more core. I really want to hear what Pete has to say.
Yeah, no, I think all this goes to, like, an organization tends to believe it is best suited to handle the work of whatever job it has in front of it. So, the FBI is going to look and say, okay, to the extent there's any conflict with local law enforcement, yes, they can go out and process this scene. But yeah, we're working with NYPD or whoever the case may be, but they're not necessarily looking at how this impacts a case that's going on in Seattle, or how there might be information here that we can share with the CIA or share with the Jordanians that is going to impact an operation that, some joint operation that we have going on, so that we need to do it, because if we just leave it to the locals, they're going to charge forward and do something that is going to adversely impact our mission. And because we're the FBI, our mission is a national one, and therefore it's more important, and therefore it should take primacy. I'm setting aside their petty things, right? I mean, people want glory or to be in front of the microphone. That exists in every organization, and just take that out of there. But I think, in my experience, the biggest conflicts where I saw the most jackassery going on was in source recruitment and handling. That, if there was somebody who's being targeted by both organizations, that if somebody either, or maybe somebody would come in that had already been a developmental, the agency was looking at somebody overseas, they rotated into the United States, they were handed off to the local, maybe they're not even handed off to the local office, maybe they're still being met by other people, but that relationship, because it is so hard to recruit somebody. People don't understand that you can't just go out and say, I need a drug source. If you're trying to get somebody in the MSS or in the SVR or in Al-Qaeda, that's not an easy thing to do. So if you've set up some operation for 3-4 years as the CIA overseas in Algiers or somewhere like that, you've made headway, you've got somewhere. The last thing you want to do is, when this guy goes to Omaha, Nebraska, go and reach out to the FBI and have somebody assigned and say, we have to work with you, and risk that. Now, that's where you try and hopefully get a measure of kind of commensurate professional capacity. But it's the same sort of thing where, like, if I've got somebody on the hook, I don't want to turn it over, because the first thing the agency is going to do is come in and say, hey, yeah, we want a joint meet. We've got their tour just started, but in 2 years they're going to be going back overseas. So we really need to take over the handling and start introducing and all these things that there's a natural tension there, because you're like, no, this is my guy. I've got this. And so that tension to me always manifested a lot in source issues. But again, if you get intelligent people who, everybody's working for the US, and people can sit down, and if you see competence and goodwill, you can overcome it. But I mean, there are plenty of people all over the government who are neither competent nor necessarily have a lot of goodwill. So that's where you get friction points.
Many of the best sources this country's ever had were recruited by the FBI inside and worked jointly.
So I just want to say on a serious note, the FBI has one other factor that the CIA does not have, which is this is a totally serious point, which is reflected in a comment just left in the chat by somebody who says the FBI arrested my abusive ex for white collar crap. I love them and always will. Heart, heart, heart. And the Pete mentioned this at the very beginning, where he said it's the FBI gets involved in matters that directly impact the lives of individuals, and I think this is a COINTELPRO is the negative side of that, but the positive side of that is that, and one of the agents, somebody who I didn't deal with directly, but I dealt with indirectly, and my colleague Susan Hennessy dealt with very directly. Daniel Alphen was killed recently, executing a warrant against in a child pornography, a child exploitation case, and I've done some work in some of those cases in the sextortion arena, and this is a world that I've interacted with, unfortunately, more than I would like to. The one thing that the Bureau does is it saves kids from hands-on abuse in cases like that, and there are a lot of people like the person I'm not going to name in the chat who mentioned this, whose lives are very directly touched by FBI work. That is also true of CIA, but generally people don't know it. So, the terrorist attack that doesn't happen because somebody did incredible work at Langley or in the field, the person whose life was touched by that probably never knows about it. There's an intimacy to the FBI and its engagement, both positive and negative, with U.S. nationals that is very, very different from anything that goes on in the agency.
And let's not forget the recent tragedy of a number of FBI agents giving their lives in order to try to catch.
Yeah, no, that's
a
one
bunch
of them. Is the person I was talking about.
Yeah.
Well, and that's true for the agency. I mean, that was one of the most horrific things from day one of the Trump presidency, was defiling the kind of all the stars on the wall at Langley and having his little conference in front of that. I thought was horrific, but there's a common shared sacrifice there in both lines of work.
All right, so the post-debate poll is up. I noticed that some people
vote early, vote often. I see early indications of voter fraud.
If we lose,
this is too
because I was voter fraud.
I'm going to release the Kraken. I have lawsuits
Did
ready
GRU
to
vote?
challenge this.
No, I want to point out that there are indications of voter fraud. Because when I last looked at the pre-debate poll, the CIA had 33%, and it's now up to 38%, 39%. So people have changed their votes on the previous poll, which is cheating. People don't do that. So we're gonna FBI was at 15, and the plurality was at.
And don't make me rapture in Sidney Powell, because I will, and she will destroy your poll. And Kate is opposing counsel for in lieu of fun. You can.
I want to say that equally. So the FBI definitely gained some ground here between these two polls. It's up to 32%.
It gained a shit ton of. The FBI is actually ahead of the CIA now. John,
but equally
Alex,
cool.
It's my fault. I was talking over Alex. I shouldn't have. I claimed that we're better with women, and then I talked over. I screwed it up.
You did.
But CIA should be far ahead.
No offense, John, but if it had just been Alex and Pete, like visually, it would have been. It would. I mean, they're just both so.
Yeah, it would have been better. It's true.
Yeah.
I just want to ask quick question.
It's the snows, isn't it?
For Alex, because for those people in the audience who don't know this, Alex writes satires about the CIA now, and she makes fun of her former agency for a living. I want to know, would it be easier or harder to make fun of the FBI for a living?
Both. There's satire in both. And actually, the second book has a lot of FBI in it, and the third one I'm working on has even more. So it's very
Gotcha.
easy
So-
to make fun of any federal employee.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Kate, who is our guest tomorrow?
I have no idea.
We have no idea.
Oh wait, I did. I put down a gauntlet in my kind of sick state. I sent. Sorry, I'm like actually like have a cold or something. I sent a message out to the internet gods that I wanted to fight someone about marriage, state-sanctioned marriage, the whether or not state-sanctioned marriage was like meaning like why we hinged state benefits on the act of marriage. Like, well, that seems like antiquated to me in a way. And I think that we're going to, but I'm not certain. I think I'm going to debate David French on it and I think it'll be kind of lovely and great.
Excellent.
So,
I love
I'm
that.
very excited.
All right.
Yeah.
So will that be tomorrow?
I think so, but I have to check with David. But
All
I'm
right.
also looking with other people. But
Tentatively tomorrow. Friday, he may need firming up on this. We're going to have a debate with John Lovett over universal time versus his idiotic daylight savings time idea.
He's really gunning for you, Ben. Like he quote retweeted you and was like, I hope.
Yeah, but he still hasn't confirmed that he's showing up to debate me.
I know. He does.
You know, he throws the punch and then like runs out of the room before I can. It's like I'll believe it when he actually shows up. All right. Thank you to Alex, Finley, Pete Strzok, and John Sipher. You are all great Americans, great deep staters, and
I love it when you guys
great
all
coup
come on.
plotters. What else can I? And we will be back.
You will be my first call if I land in prison after Ben, who is not my lawyer because he's not a lawyer.
And we'll be back 22 hours and 38 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we do have needlessly stoked interagency rivalries between different agencies of the U.S. intelligence community that just have different missions and have finely tuned
so great that we can
workforces.
fight
We need them
amongst
both.
ourselves now that we don't have this like other giant specter to fight against. I think it's nice. It's a luxury.
It's great. We can turn on ourselves and fight like cats and dogs. Thank you all